Hello and welcome to this Comics Track presentation on race and gender. I'm Carrie Neely and I'm the coordinator for the Comics and Popular Arts Conference, also known as CPAC. This year, CPAC is coming to you virtually through panels such as this one and also via our website. You can check out content there at comicspopularartsconference.org. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about CPAC. The mission of CPAC is to promote scholarship on popular culture and to encourage the engagement between scholars and fans in order to deepen our understanding of comics and the other popular arts. We accept papers each year around October, so if you like what you see here today, you might consider submitting an abstract. Those abstracts go through a peer review process where the board and other scholars look at each of the abstracts and make selections based on scholarly merit and theoretical framework. That doesn't mean that if you're not affiliated with a university that you can't submit an abstract. We accept abstracts from everyone. CPAC is supported by the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology and the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Texas at Dallas. On behalf of my colleagues on the CPAC board, I welcome you to this panel discussion on race and gender. We'll have presentations today from Jillian Browning from the University of Florida and Tasha Browning from Walden University. Also, Andrew Grunsky from Mercer University and Christopher Richardson from Young Harris College. I hope you enjoy today's presentation, and hopefully you'll check out our other content again at comicspopularartsconference.org.
Hi, I'm Chris Richardson, and I'd like to talk about Batman, gender, and sexuality today. Unfortunately, we can't be getting together in Atlanta during DragonCon for the Comics and Popular Arts Conference that goes on every year. I really wish we could. Instead, I'm recording the talk that I would have given there, and with the next best thing to cosplay, I suppose, which is my Batman and Joker cutouts. So, as I said, this is the talk I would have given. I suppose a little bit of background before we get started. I'm Chris Richardson, again, the chair of Communication Studies and the program director for popular culture at Young Harris College, which is a small liberal arts school just outside of Atlanta. And I've been working on this project for a little bit that's about to come out now as a book with Routledge called Batman and the Joker, Contested Sexuality in Popular Culture. That comes out October 2020, and I'll put a link at the end of this video in case anyone's interested. There's a discount code you can use with Routledge. But that project is about thinking through Batman and representations, primarily in comics, and how gender works to play a significant role in it, of course, in various ways that we might not have originally anticipated or that we might not think about, especially in classic renditions of Batman from the early 40s until now. So that's what the project is about. I also host a podcast called This Is Not a Pipe Podcast, and I just want to mention that because I've had the privilege of talking to some really great scholars. Frederick Kohlert is in charge of the whole production of a number of books coming out on gender, sexuality, and comics. And so I was able to talk to him. I was able to talk to Will Brooker, Ramsey Fawaz, Nick Susanis, who wrote Unflattening, as well as a number of other really great scholars. And so I just want to say thank you to them, because without those conversations with This Is Not a Pipe Podcast, I definitely wouldn't have been able to construct the kinds of hopefully nuanced and well-supported arguments that are now present in that larger project, and that I'll share a little bit with you today. So I want to think about a certain character that I'm sure very few people are familiar with when it comes to Batman. I definitely wasn't until I started looking back over the very early issues that came out starting in 1939 and then going into the 40s and so on. And I came across this character in issue number 5 of Batman, 1941, named Queenie. Queenie, unlike virtually all of the people around Batman, sees almost immediately that Batman and Bruce Wayne are probably the same person. He happens to have cut his chin shaving that day, and she instantly notices that Batman and Bruce Wayne both have this little nick on their chin, and that can't just be a coincidence. So the character doesn't get really well developed. In fact, it's kind of interesting that we're introduced to her, and almost immediately she dies. But two interesting things happen, at least I thought they were interesting, in that they've helped me think through some of the bigger issues that I want to highlight today about Batman, gender, and sexuality. So this character, who herself doesn't quite fit into gender norms, I mean, her name is Queenie. She is part of the Joker's crew, but of course, the Joker quickly turns on her, and she's left to die on this boat, basically. But even more important than that, and her ability to identify the connection between Bruce Wayne and Batman, she saves Batman's life. And that doesn't seem like a huge deal, but when you think about the contemporary representations of Batman as pretty much invulnerable, yes, he's perhaps died in various situations only to come back. You know, there's a number of special comics, Final Crisis among them, that we see Batman sort of die, but maybe not or not really. Even The Dark Knight with Frank Miller, we kind of see that, but of course we also don't. And it gets murky. But she saves Batman's life, and what I realized is that this trope happens again and again. We probably think about Robin saving Batman's life, as he does in virtually every comic in the beginning, but what it points to more broadly, what I think, is a sort of challenge to the traditional manly man that we were kind of prescribed for a long time now, but especially in the 30s and 40s, up until today. And those kinds of characters don't need help, especially from women, especially from people who are less powerful than them. And yet, as I was reading through these early issues of Batman, over and over again, he's right about to die. And in fact, most of the time, he doesn't even know it. Someone's going to shoot him from behind, somebody's going to set a trap for him that kills him instantly, and Robin or Queenie or a number of other characters are always kind of jumping in to save him. Not so different from like Inspector Gadget type of situations. The interesting thing about that is that we're introduced to what appears to be a really vulnerable character, and yet he's also quite heroic, and he's the sort of quintessential man of the 1930s when he's smoking a pipe and when he's in his lounge jacket and in his mansion and discussing with Robin why he should or shouldn't do various things. He's always telling women and young people how they should act, very much like Leave It to Beaver in later decades. And of course, that trope continues as well. But that's not so interesting to me. I mean, that I think is what we would expect from a character who is a representation of a sort of powerful, traditional male character. What we don't expect so much is this vulnerability and this need for others to help save his life. I mean, Batman would be dead in almost all of the issues that occurred, especially early on, if it wasn't for somebody intervening and saving him, which says a lot about the competition between different discourses at the time. I want to think about a few frameworks that we could use, broadly under the category of queer theory, but of course that's a difficult term to pin down. I wouldn't trust anybody who says that they can define queer theory, especially in a sentence or two. I think very much like Raymond Williams talking about culture, it's also, especially now, one of the most difficult words in the English language because it varies so much depending on context. I also want to highlight that there's this whole sort of gay debate about Batman that stemmed from work. I'm sure a lot of people watching this, if you're interested in comics, you know about this, but Frederick Wortham was a psychiatrist who dealt with a number of people in New York, young people, and cautioned about the dangers of comics. And he actually highlights Batman and Robin as a homosexual relationship or a dream for homosexuals that they could start to see and then question and then become the dreaded homosexual of the 1950s that people obviously weren't open to. I mean, it was considered a mental disease in the DSM up until the 60s and 70s, and so that was a big threat to people. And so that was a sort of hidden subtext of Batman that Frederick Wortham highlights. Of course, I don't think Bill Finger or Bob Kane, who created Batman, had that in mind per se, although they obviously became aware of it when these debates started happening and then when people started burning these books and really vilifying people who would read comics, especially people who would read certain comics like Batman and Robin and be inspired to lead a non-traditional lifestyle. And so there's this sort of subtext that I think a lot of us are familiar with now, that maybe Batman and Robin are gay, or maybe there's this subtext that there's sort of hidden meaning to their relationship. There are a number of websites you can find, there are a number of images you can find that question this, sometimes jokingly, sometimes seriously, sometimes in a sort of liberating way, sometimes definitely not. And yet, that's not really what I want to get at in this talk. I don't want to assert, I don't think it's necessarily right or wrong, but I definitely don't want to assert that Batman is secretly gay or closeted homosexual. I think that really limits how we can read him. But I do very much think that Batman is queer. And I want to explain a little bit of what I mean by that. So, queer can mean a number of things, and queer theory and queer analysis can do a number of things, but I think the most powerful and the most general thing it can do is just question the traditions of normalcy that we take for granted when we're reading a book about Batman or when we're dealing with a popular film or a popular text of any kind, right? What we can start to look for are the cues that tell us that support various things about what's normal and what's not normal. And so here is where we can start to question Batman without saying like, haha, he's actually gay or he's actually straight or he's actually whatever we want to claim, because of course he's a comic. He doesn't actually exist. He's not actually in my room right now, and he's definitely not one thing and only one thing. But that's also a very queer understanding, right? That he can be different things to different people at different times, and that's not necessarily wrong. I mean, it gets outside of that paradigm that Batman is or he isn't something. And I think that perspective is something that all of, or very few of the comics at the time, very few of the popular discourses, but Batman, the Batman comic books, the detective comic books, help us kind of consider the alternative possibilities of how we can interpret that. There's this kind of funny in this context example that I found looking back in the early comics where Batman puts on these queer lenses. And so there's special glasses that help him see, and he shuts off the lights and he attacks these goons in a building with these glasses that help him see things that other people can't. And I use that in my book to talk about the way that Batman, reading Batman, and kind of getting involved, like beyond simply reading the words or looking at the pictures, but asking what's in between these panels and what is the possible subtext, no matter what you want to read into it, what might be going on between this image and this image, or between this word and that word on the next page. And so, in a way, we can put on these queer glasses and we can see things that are both there and not there, which is one of the really cool things about comics. Batman helps us do that by asking about masculinity itself. I mean, when you think about it, there are a number of interesting claims that Wortham makes. Whether they're accurate or not accurate is a whole other debate. But he points to the fact that he has a very close relationship with Robin, the fact that he's constantly being saved and that they have these tender moments. And I mean, that's not really debatable. I mean, that happens in the books. The question is, how does that affect young people and what might happen if people read that and what was the intention behind that? That can all be debated. But Batman presents an interesting case in which you have a bachelor who seems to fall in line with a number of conventions and is often presented with beautiful women that he is supposed to date. But he always pleases them in a way that demonstrates that he's doing it for them, or he's doing it for a society that's watching, not because he's doing it for himself, which also talks about these issues of sort of normalcy, traditional, hegemonic masculinity, versus alternatives to that. And Batman is an interesting case in which he goes between those. So Queenie is an example of that. Obviously, she's in and out of the Batman world very quickly, but she jumps in the way of a bullet, saves Batman, therefore demonstrating his vulnerability and his contingency. That's an important element as well, right? Batman is actually, if you look at the history, he's taken on a number of characteristics he wanted when he was being created, by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. They wanted to make another Superman, but they couldn't because Superman already existed and he was already bright colored and had all of these superpowers. As you know, I'm sure Batman is kind of the opposite, right? He's darker, he's more solitary, he's more vulnerable in many ways. He's not superhuman. And so at the same time, though, he's always dealing with that image of Superman and contrasting himself. So one of the things that helps to define Batman is his not being Superman, but always being parallel in some way. And I think you could take that and you could say the same about this idea of the hegemonic, perfect man of the time, whether we're talking about 1940s or whether we're talking about 2020. And he's always conscious of that, it seems, the character, but he's never that. He might pretend to be, he might be a striking bachelor, he might be a very strong, heroic, powerful person, but then we always see these other sides where he's vulnerable, where Queenie, as an example again, tries to save him, gets shot and is dying. She requests that he kiss her, and he does, to please her, not to please him. And this is something that you can see over and over again with Catwoman when she's introduced as the Cat, and when she goes on a crime spree and says, if I could just be with Bruce Wayne, I would be happy and therefore I wouldn't have to commit crime. Suddenly Bruce Wayne comes in and woos her as a bachelor, and then they plan to get married. And this is very early, this is not the recent Batman, but at the same time he's doing this to prevent crime from happening in the city. So he's becoming this this groom in order to help Gotham City, not necessarily because he wants to be. This happens with Vicky Vale when she is proposed to by a very powerful foreigner, and she doesn't want to marry this person, but she also doesn't want to upset him. Suddenly she says she's going to marry Batman, and they have a secret relationship, and he can't get out of this because if he does, then this guy could get mad and hurt Gotham and its people. So suddenly he pretends to do this, except he's very happy to get out of this at the end, and he celebrates with Robin, having a glass of grade A milk. Now there are many ways that we could interpret this. Alexander Doty's great book, Flaming Classics, is a wonderful example of how you can perform queer readings without necessarily accepting that you're transforming it from a popular text that is not queer into queer for your own personal desires or something, and saying that, well, actually, we shouldn't assume that everything is heterosexual and straight, and that any queer reading is an alternative version of it. Maybe it really is queer, we just don't know it, or we just can't identify it because it's not out there in your face saying, like, this is a queer character. And so I like that idea that we shouldn't assume that all characters are straight until proven otherwise, and we shouldn't assume that all texts are straight until proven otherwise. Instead, I'm also not saying we should do the reverse, by the way, but I think what we can do is take a note from Judith Butler. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with her work on performativity and gender trouble, particularly, as well as a number of other great books that you should definitely check out if you haven't. But she's interested in how we perform this thing, masculinity, femininity, or what have you, because we've sort of seen it and we know that it should be happening, or at least we have this sense that it should be happening, so we perform it very much like Bruce Wayne performs this sort of buffoonish bachelor in many cases who doesn't want to work and who doesn't want to do anything and who's sleeping all day because he's lazy, right? That's the impression that he often gives. And when really he's doing this as a performance so that we don't think he's Batman. I think we could get down to it and say, like, Bruce Wayne is not real in the sense that that's who that person is. That's a performance. But obviously Batman is a performance in order to scare criminals. I mean, that's why he says he wears his getup, as well as to strike fear into superstitious criminals and things like this, right? In order to become more of a myth than he could be as a regular guy trying to fight crime. So Batman's not him. And so we don't really have him. We could debate this for a long time. I'm sure maybe you have with your friends. Who's the real, is Batman or Bruce Wayne the real person, or how does that work? I think that in general also sets up a great way to think more about how do we work? How do we work as people? How do we interpret ourselves, and how do we interpolate a lot of these things that we see, like this is masculine and I want to be masculine, or this is feminine and I want to be feminine. Batman and Bruce Wayne and the characters that mingle in these books allow us to see performances all the time, which is what Butler argues is happening, right? There's no underneath of the performance. There's always performance. So you could be performing a scholar, you could be performing a fan, you could be performing a straight guy, you could be performing a gay guy. All of these are performances. They're not real in the sense that, underneath it all, this is it. if we look at Batman and move away from what's often spoken of or implied in a lot of the discourses, that he's this Superman type character who is almost invulnerable, and think about just how vulnerable he is and just how vulnerable his performances are when he's often identified, and he's worried about that. He's worried people will find out who he really is. He's worried that that he won't be able to fight and continue his struggles. And then he's helped out by people, including a number of women who prevent his death early on, especially in a lot of these situations, as well as his close relationships with people like Alfred, Selena Kyle. They all point to Batman as a vulnerable, contingent personality who is many things and is constantly performing who he is in light of what his society sort of tells him to be, but also questioning that. I mean, he's part of society, but he's a little bit outside society. He is making choices, but he's also not completely autonomous. He can't choose all of the things that are part of his situation. All of this points to a sort of questioning, a queering perhaps, of how we think about the world, and that Batman as a great example, but not by far the only example, of how a queer reading of these texts can help us metaphorically sort of put on these queer lenses that allow us to see things that are there, but not clearly or explicitly there, and allow us to think more deeply about the sort of nuanced performances that we are all engaging in throughout our days and throughout our lives. That is, I think, one of the reasons why we can all, to an extent, identify with, and that we all kind of love, Batman and Bruce Wayne. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jillian Browning, and this is my sister Tasha Browning, and we are going to be presenting the paper, The Formation of a Black Trauma Identity, African American Trauma Identity Development versus the Wakandan Utopia. Like I said, my name is Jillian Marie Browning. I am an art educator and visual artist. I currently work for the School of Art and Art History at the University of Florida. My primary research study within my art and also within my comic studies is feminine identity and also things through the lens of the contemporary Black experience.
Hi, my name is Tasha Browning. I am a licensed mental health counselor. I'm also a certified clinical trauma professional, and my specialty is in trauma and trauma perspectives, providing counseling and consultation to individuals and organizations through holistic integrative perspectives on trauma treatment and trauma interventions.
All right, we're going to get started.
So our first image is a Sankofa bird, and this is very relevant to the idea of an identity development because in West African culture in particular, this bird is from ideas that stem from Ghana. The idea is to return and get it, and the bird itself usually has an egg in its mouth, and the understanding of this meaning is that the egg represents the future. And the bird is still flying forward and moving forward, although it is mindful of looking behind it because it is understood that who we are that frees us to embrace who we are is also understanding our past. We cannot become the individuals that we are meant to be in this life without understanding where we come from and who we are.
All right.
So trauma. So trauma is a very complex topic, but just to understand the basics of trauma, we understand that trauma is an event that's outside our normal human experience. Trauma generally leaves individuals feeling powerless, helpless, sometimes hopeless, and paralyzed. Trauma tends to be very sudden, overwhelming. Trauma changes everything the individual knows to be true in their life. We end up having trauma reactions that are of fight, flight, or freeze, the most common four trauma reactions that human beings experience. But normally human beings, they usually fall somewhere within the freeze response when we are first initially impacted by trauma. Trauma disturbs our thinking. Trauma disturbs our life. Trauma imprints on us on a physical level. Trauma changes everything suddenly. We are, encountering with a life-threatening experience. And because of that, we have reactions. Those reactions are based upon just survival responses. And trauma itself could be one immediate event. It could be prolonged experiences over a generation. Trauma could be anything from a natural disaster. It could be violence. It could be genocide. It could be anything that is a disruption of an individual's life that leaves these scars, these emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual scars that will require some level of intervention and healing. When we look at trauma from a psychological level, trauma can also be diagnosed, more commonly understood as being PTSD. And PTSD is given a name of a cluster of different types of symptoms that trauma survivors go through. But mainly note that in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, an individual has to experience a certain length of trauma, a frequency in the trauma, symptoms associated with the trauma, and then there's a severity of the level of trauma that individuals go to, that they would receive these prolonged understandings of how their life has changed and then be diagnosed with PTSD. Understand that the more severe the trauma, the longer the symptoms persist. So what's cultural trauma? If we can understand trauma on a personal or individual level, I think that we can relate that to how trauma can be very relevant on a historical level. When we look at historical trauma, we're talking about cultural trauma. When we're talking about cultural trauma, we're talking about historical trauma on a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that takes place over a lifespan across generations of people. And it's a massive group collective experience of trauma. Some examples of that would be the Holocaust, the Trail of Tears experienced by Indigenous people here in North America or other parts of the Americas. And then also, of course, slavery, in terms of slavery experienced here in the United States and the process of trying to move through the ideas left over from slavery and colonialism. Massive historical trauma causes unresolved grief. It's a grief that is a collective shared experience among a group of people based upon a belief, skin color, sex, gender, any of these horrendous types of marks and any of these horrendous types of injuries that are caused to individuals over a group collective is felt in a group consciousness. And with that, the impact of the trauma then becomes a memory. And it's a memory that's forever woven into the cultural experiences of that group of people. It becomes part of their cultural identity. It changes the direction of their cultural identity and their future identities in ways that'll just irreparable. With that, there's a cultural memory that's formed, and in this cultural memory, people are forced to embrace these formations of these identities that are either imprinted upon them, placed upon them, or a part of a violence that would not be a part of their culture typically if they weren't experiencing these massive levels of trauma. People have losses or tears to their identity in historical trauma too. And then also some of the social fabric that's woven into how people collectively exist is then injured. And people form some sort of understanding that this collective trauma brings them together in a cohesion, but also has torn and ripped them apart from understandings in their culture that have not been allowed to organically develop and take place. So what happens when there's an identity formation under a cultural trauma? Identity formation under cultural trauma also impacts the formation of the sense of self. When you think of identity formation, think about an individual forming a sense of self. And in the way in which we form that sense of self, we question and find answers to what I believe, who I am, where is my foundation, what is my purpose, what is my worth, what is my identity. This identity is the blueprint for how a person will form their life. You do not form your life, find your purpose, find your passions, understand why you are living in the existence that you're living in without forming an identity of some sort. When people form trauma identities, they're forming these identities with the imprint of traumatic events. When these traumatic events are imprinted on the individual, it disrupts plans and alters their lives in unpredictable ways, and then sometimes in permanent ways. We are forced in trauma identities to reevaluate what our life goals are. Things can change suddenly. We may have dreams. Those dreams are wiped away. We may have struggles. Those struggles now become the cultural struggle and the cultural trauma that takes place. Our values and beliefs about the world become shattered. We feel very uncertain. We can have a lot of fear in the world. We can have a lot of anxiety. We can also question whether or not we believe inherently that the world is good or that the world is safe. Second, how is this like relevant to slavery? Well, in the United States, there's a very discomforting history in terms of slavery in the United States, but it's very much a part of our nation's heritage. People seldomly figure the sociological concepts into our U.S. national identity, but the legacy of racial inequality and tensions is very relevant, and it's also very much the way in which people have experienced cultural trauma. We can still see this legacy among our heritages here in the United States in the way ideas of white supremacy is supported, the ways in which their injustice is looked at, and the ways in which systemic racism is woven into the roots of how we function as a society. So this then opens up a new perspective on what the actual Black American identity is and how its experience of slavery becomes a memory of slavery, and its roots are very much imprinted on all of the societal constructs in how we function in this existence right now in the world. This systemic injury that continues to take place in the constructs of our societal organizations is generational trauma among people of color. In essence, it's cultural trauma, and slavery formed under this identity among African Americans can constitute historical identity that's rooted in a collective memory of what slavery is and what it means to have an identity that is then based upon having that imprint of that injury in our life as citizens and as Americans, and as we start to think about what that identity is for us in this country. So how is this relevant to Wakanda? How is this relevant to Black Panther? Well, one of the examples is, as we start to look at this scene, first off, this is a fictional formation of a society. This is a fictional formation of a society that has a view and a formation that was not influenced by colonialism. I think that's very important to take in consideration, because in this society, it was not influenced by white supremacy. White supremacy does not exist in this fictional world. So this culture has been able to form and evolve without this perspective of a dominance being asserted on them. They've been able to create standards for their own cultural that's relevant for them. They've been able to protect their land. They've been able to own land. They've been able to find value in their land. They've been able to preserve the right to the value in their land. They have rights in their land. They have different tribes that have an uninterrupted lineage in how they've settled into their land. They're able to then build and add value to your land, which is what you can see in the context of building this city and this civilization as we look out over the vastness of the land of Wakanda. And with that, they've been able to, top priority, maintain and retain the land and the culture that exists in Wakanda. So in contrast, when we look at African American culture and we look at have an identity that's based in slavery, you know, there was no rights to land. There was extreme resilience needed to be built up by African Americans in order to survive. So there's no rights in the say that you have in what happens to you. There's no rights in family. There's no rights in you and your children. There's no rights for you to even own or have your children. You are always forced to think about how to make something out of nothing, because you're not starting with this birthright. You're not starting in an understanding that there's generational wealth, or there is minimal wealth created among African Americans in this time of the after effects of slavery. So only being able to understand yourself from the terms of having to survive and having to overcome and having to, you know, make something out of nothing continues that legacy of those injuries, of trauma, and it continues the ideas of understanding that I can only trace back my ancestors so far. I can only go so far in my understanding. I only have a connection to the African diaspora and to my homeland, and where I know my lineage and my roots come from based upon one simple thing, and that is the color of my skin, and the melanin in my skin gives me one connection in knowing that I at least come from somewhere. But you can only trace your ancestors back. Most African Americans can only trace their ancestors back to the port in which they came in on.
So talking about a little bit about generational wealth and being a Black American and not necessarily having that from a long lineage. So we can talk a little bit about the old saying, 40 acres and a mule. So basically what that comes from is that right after the slavery was abolished, General William T. Sherman signed a Special Field Order 15 that set aside 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land in the Southeast, newly freed slaves. So in that, basically each family shall have a plot of no more than 40 acres of tillable ground. So they could actually use it. They could grow things. They could make money from that. It's also said that some families got old leftover army mules. So it later became known as 40 acres and a mule. But after Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson reversed that order, giving back that land to its original Confederate owners, and it left many of the Black families as sharecroppers, and they're often working for their own previous slave owners.
So a couple examples from Black Panther. One, we see definite disconnections from ancestral bonds, and we see this disconnection being a detriment to identity formations. So first we have T'Challa, and with his lineage and with his bonds, we can see that he has a direct connection to his ancestors. He has an actual meet and support and a discussion with his ancestors, and he knows who they are. He knows he's from a line of kings. He knows that he's from a line of Black Panthers, and he's able to connect with them and also have connection with them as he meets them on this alternate reality.
So another example of this, as well as within the comic book, where you can see he's having a council now with past Black Panthers. And in this panel, it says, "Honored fathers, mighty warriors, fearsome priests, Black Panthers all, in the name of Bass, I call upon you to counsel." So he's always able to call upon these people. And it's also important to note that not only does he know who they are, but because of his connection with them, they also always know who he is.
So the contrast of this would be Eric. Eric's connection to the ancestral plane when he first takes over and becomes king definitely is the idea of stepping into a trauma memory. He has no real strong connection to who he is or where he's from. His biggest lineage connection is his father. So when he steps into what he would consider to be the ancestral plane, the first thing he thinks about is the apartment he grew up in as a kid, the apartment that he witnessed his father's death, but also that's the the place that he felt the most safe. With that, he walked in immediately and went to safety measures. He went to the secret room in the apartment. He went to finding the book where he found his father's chain. He put the chain on. He really is only reliving this trauma from his childhood, and he turns into a boy as he walks into this apartment, which is a good example of living your trauma through your childhood, but then also trying to develop yourself as a man. With that, he converts himself back and forth from child to man as he has these conversations, and then is finally greeted and finally understood to meet anyone that would, so to speak, greet him and talk to him in his ancestral plane, and that becomes his father. And with that, he starts to do a level of trauma work to try to have this conversation with his father. But at that point, his understanding, his connection to who he is so lost, he's not really able to meet his father on any particular level, psychologically or emotionally, but to have these minimal interactions that are very emotionless and very much focused on just moving through this point and getting back to being king.
I would also like to note as well that as you see T'Challa's ancestral plane, it's a wide, vast prairie. It's a field. It's basically you can't see past where he's going. It's wide, it's vast. You see Eric's ancestral plane. It's the apartment that he found his father dead in. Out the window, you can see the sky is purple, all of that. So you can tell that, yes, this is the ancestral plane, but he's never been able to get over this one part of his life. It literally completely formed his entire identity, is this one part of his life.
So the next example we have of a trauma identity formed is looking at the way the presentation of an uninterrupted fictional identity formation of a Black man is presented in this film. Meaning T'Challa sees himself as king. He grew up knowing that he was king. His decision making is respected. It's also uninterrupted, and it is his own. He has a firm identity and foundation in understanding and knowing his intelligence. He knows what his responsibilities are. His manhood is never questioned, and his manhood has also never been stripped from him or violated. With that, he has an understanding that the formation of his identity is really built around where he comes from and knowing his expectations of what it is to be king and knowing where his future lies and the projection of where he wants his life to go, but then also the life of the people that he's responsible for. So Eric, automatically we can see that there's a disruption in the fictional identity formation of him, because first start off with him having two names. He has his Wakanda name, and then he also has his American name, which is Eric, which means that he really is, split in having no real rooting in either of these names. He has two partially formed identities in both of these places. His only identity really right now is living through that trauma of losing his father and trying to figure out where he comes from. But in this, he's really disconnected and orphaned in the US, and he grows up with no father.
Exactly. So I also would like to speak on the idea that both of these people watched their father die. So in contrast, though, we see T'Challa, his father died in a very traumatic way, but T'Challa is a grown man when this happens. He already has an idea of what his identity is. He already has the idea of what he's going to do. He's already been taking steps to know that he needs to step in as king of Wakanda. He's already has his life planned out for him. In turn, when Eric walks in and sees his father dying, he is just a boy. He has no formation for his life yet at all. He has now the paternal figure that he's had in his life is now being stripped from him, which also mirrors some Black men in inner cities who also grow up with no paternal figure, maybe that they lost them in a traumatic way, kind of similar to what Eric did, which I think this was written into this particular movie and plot point on purpose to really mirror that, but also showing the idea that both of these men lost their fathers, but at two different times, but also how that can then form the identity that you have. I also would like to talk about other ways that like Black people and the Black diaspora in general cultivate their identity and also express their identity, and that's in clothing. So as we can see here with T'Challa, he's at council right now, and basically how he's dressed in his traditional robes. He's always really put together. When he's out and not in Wakanda, he's usually wearing a suit. He's a diplomat. He's a politician. So that's how he holds himself. But we see that when Eric defeats T'Challa and he becomes king, he walks in a long coat. He has open shirt. He has all his scars showing. He has his the collar that is worn is, to me, very reminiscent of a chain and how his father's chain, and also reminiscent sort of like 90s hip hop style, where his idea of what a ruler is supposed to be is sort of rooted in this sort of gangster identity, and like this is the kind of ruler that he is going to be, and it's a very large parallel to what T'Challa is.
So in conclusion, I think that as we look at how identity is formed, we can see where if we contrast and compare African-American identity and Wakanda, we can see that there are some strong parallels in things that take place when colonialism is involved, and then also how the organic development of a culture can take place in very positive ways without the influences of colonialism.
So that's for our presentation. If you want some more information on where to find us, both of our informations are right here. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about what we are doing, or if you just want to talk about this a lot. We're definitely kind of combining our two interests in this, and it was very fun to do. So again, thank you so much for watching our presentation.
Thank you.
Joining me today. My name is Dr. Andrew Grunsky. I am an Associate Professor of Education at Mercer University, and I'm here today to talk to you about how we went from judo tricks to hairstyle tips, the supplemental comic features, and the creation of a feminized space. So, by way of short history, in August of 1964, American Quarterly called attention to romance comics, a widely popular but easily overlooked medium, whose readership lay at the intersection of a number of frequently marginalized groups: young, female, and lower middle class. By the early 1960s, romance comics had maintained a significant American readership for more than a decade and a half. The stories contained in these comic books offered advice on how a girl could best come to terms with her own ambitions and desires. Specifically, they worked to foster young ladies' desires for a virtuous mate, a man of financial means, and romance and love. The romance comics provided historians a useful artifact in how popular media served to educate young women about their decidedly narrow and domestic expected role in the life of the American family. The first romance comic was published in 1947 by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who we all remember best as the creators of Captain America. It was called Young Romance, and it was an instant sensation. Within a year of Young Romance reaching newsstands, over 120 copycats were also in publication. These included such titles as New Romance, Popular Romance, Thrilling Romances, Teenage Romances, Teenage Temptations, and Teenage Diary Secrets. The comics themselves followed the same basic format. They were almost all anthologies of short romantic stories. They featured a new set of characters for each tale. Rarely did a character reappear for further adventures. However, they mostly fit the same general type: virtuous, white, lower middle class, and in search of marriage. Essentially, the comics tried to continue to capture that female readership who had outgrown Archie comics. After World War II, as the baby boom was taking hold, courtship practices were in flux. This was new dating terrain, and romance comics were helping young people to acclimate themselves to the new social situations. The implication of a comic book cover claiming that it happened to one of our readers, it can happen to you, is that there was something in the comic book itself that would allow young women to access information that would help them successfully negotiate the new courtship roles of a changing society. The superhero comics of the 1940s, including and especially those aimed at female readers, were a very different space from those of the romance comics of the 1950s. This was particularly true of Marston's Wonder Woman comics, which were always, at least in their own way, a vehicle for Marston's visions of reforming society as a matriarchy. As part of the educational vision of the comics, each issue of Wonder Woman, at least while Marston was still living, contained a short 4-page spread profiling a famous woman from history and highlighting her contributions. The Wonder Women of History, as the feature was called, taught children about major historical figures like Marie Curie, Florence Nightingale, Sojourner Truth, who's the first page of her spread we can see here, Joan of Arc, Sacagawea, who we can also see here. Famous figures in women's history like that, beginning with Wonder Woman number 1 in January of 1942 and continuing until Wonder Woman number 57 in May of 1954. Wonder Woman comics were engaged in more than just providing young comic readers with positive female role models. They were also engaged in directly educating their readers about women's history. Indeed, given the state of history instruction during the period, these vignettes may have been most readers' only exposure to women's history. These short educational vignettes were not unique to Wonder Woman comics. Superhero comics of the 1940s, including and especially female superhero comics, also included any number of other lessons. For instance, Black Cat comics contained a regular feature that taught self-defense for young women. Debuting in 1941, early issues of Black Cat, a female superhero who was a movie star by day but donned a mask and revealing costume to fight Nazis and underworld criminals by night, contained a regular featurette called Judo Tricks that taught step-by-step instructions to young women to defend themselves in a variety of situations. And you can see a couple of examples of that on the screen as well. While the supplemental features of superhero comics in the 1940s were teaching women's history and self-defense, the romance comics of the 1950s served as a sort of practical sex education. The authors of these romance comics were keenly aware of the audience for their work, in terms of age, gender, and geography. Comic book production was, at least prior to the 1980s, centralized in large urban centers, where groups of artists worked in bullpens, under supervision of editorial teams. For romance comics, the site of production was generally New York. The reader and the setting, however, were not. There was an assumption among romance comic writers that their readers were preteen and teenage girls. As St. John's romance comic writer Erwin Stein declared in an interview, well, since your readership generally stopped about 13, 14 for these things, 12 for most of them, then you wrote about high school-age kids, up to college sometimes. Locales for the story were generally in the Midwest. A place like St. Louis was more likely to appear as a setting even than New York, and smaller nondescript American towns were more likely yet. We get a picture of the audience for romance comics that was young, female, and frequently rural or suburban. The central theme of the romance comic was the promotion of the idea of matrimony. The goal of finding a marriageable mate was the underlying motivation for nearly all of the female protagonists of romance comic storylines, and the stories frequently culminated with wedding bells. This attitude towards marriage extended to the comic's supplemental features. Especially in the 1950s, advice columnists in romance comics seemed permissive and accepting of relationships that might have been, in other times and places, seen as taboo. One letter to Doris Bigelow's mailbag in December of 1951 was written by a 16-year-old girl who was dating a 26-year-old man. Many of the girl's compatriots were concerned about the age difference, despite the fact that she, quote, likes him very much. Doris's advice lacked the concern of the girl's friends. You get along nicely with him, so why should you stop dating him? Don't let the comments of well-meaning but interfering friends come between you. Such advice seemed aimed at promoting romantic relationships in the young in ways that would become unthinkable even in the pages of a romance comic just a few years later. In the 1960s, as the matrimonial goals espoused by sex educators began to shift from simply getting married to having a fulfilling marriage, so too did the pages of the romance comics become, at least relatively speaking, spaces more inclined to promote the idea of female agency, even if it was still mediated by the approval of important males in the young woman's life. For instance, in January of 1963, a young woman from Newport News, Virginia, asked advice columnist Jane Jones for advice about a problem similar to the one that Doris Bigelow had received a decade later. The letter outlined the problem in this way. I'm 16 years old, and I met a soldier who's 22, and I'm very much in love with him. He says that he loves me. What do you think? Jane's advice was markedly different from Doris's. You've just met the boy, he's in the army, and both of you are still very young. Show your dad you're being sensible about this romance, and he'll have no cause to object. The advice column from 1963 lacks the matrimonial urgency of the advice about a similar situation offered in 1951. But the relationship still needed to be approved by a male authority in the young girl's life. It's also important to note that superhero comics also began promoting the idea of matrimony as well. So you saw, for instance, the Wonder Woman of History supplemental feature get replaced in Wonder Woman comics by Marriage a la Mode, which was a supplemental feature that profiled marriage traditions from around the globe. So it wasn't just romance comics that bought into this idea of the promoting of matrimony through the supplemental featurette. Romance comics provided education on a large variety of social topics. For instance, young women were warned against the dangers of emotional manipulation if a young man were to think they were crying in an attempt to get their own way. One recurring column billed itself as The Rules of Love. It warned that tears were the most unfair weapons in a young girl's arsenal, and that young men resent crybabies. Another comic offered practical advice about how to handle the situation if one went to a picture show and there were no usher. Plain common sense tells you that your escort leads the way. Whether or not plain common sense does tell a person that, the romance comic made the expectation explicit. Clearly engaging in overt attempts to educate their audiences about appropriate behavior in a variety of social settings with potential romantic partners, these supplemental features, stuck between romantic tales in these comic books, attempted a sort of education of the gaps. They focused on the practical interpersonal skills that may have been missing from a girl's home education and almost certainly were missing from school's sex ed curricula. So you would get pieces of advice like, learn to be a skillful shopper. It's almost a sure guarantee you'll be a skillful wife, after you've skillfully chosen your husband, of course. Education in proper grooming habits was a staple of the romance comic. Supplements like Eyes Have It taught young ladies how to pluck, tweeze, and pencil their brows to complement the shape of their face. Learning effective eye makeup procedures was a more surefire way of attracting a man than the baby talk that makes a boy feel like a daddy before he's fully grown. The romance comic Teen Confessions periodically published illustrations of the latest fads in hairstyling, complete with directions for how their readers could recreate the hairdos at home. Their Styled for Romance supplement gave step-by-step illustrated instructions on how to use rollers, brushes, rubber bands, and combs to maintain stylish coiffures. Girls were also taught the importance of wearing cosmetics. A teenager should have a bit of makeup on her face. A touch of lipstick, a dab of rouge, a dusting of face powder will give your face just the right amount of color and enhance your feminine allure. Comic books had long traded in highly sexualized images of the female body. This was not limited to, but surely included romance comics. What distinguished romance comics from the other genres in the medium, though, was that romance comics had the ability not only to teach young women the perceived importance of making themselves appealing objects for the male gaze, they also had the ability to teach young girls how to make themselves so. The supplemental features provided direct instruction in various aspects of the feminine identity to aid them in becoming successful themselves. At times, the comics even established mechanisms for helping people meet potential suitors. A correspondence club developed in some romance comics, including Cinderella Love and Diary Secrets. The special column was a mixed romantic and patriotic enterprise. It provided young women an opportunity to write a lonely serviceman who might be disappointed at mail call. The comics were also, at least in this regard, perhaps more racially progressive than other media outlets. They routinely published letters from African American or Negro servicemen because, quote, all boys share the same loneliness and desire for mail. This was true despite the fact that the stories themselves virtually never featured minority or disabled characters. In a sense, the romance comics and their supplements were a little more akin to the parenting manuals published in the 1920s. They were part of a cottage industry that traded in informally educational materials designed to target, or potentially to exploit, depending on your point of view, the needs and desires of a specific group of people. Perusing the ads in these romance comics gives a much clearer sense of the educational space to which these texts belonged. The advertisement sections were saturated with self-help books, designed with the lonely hearts who read the romance comics in mind. They promised to improve one's ability to write love letters, to make it easier to talk to members of the opposite sex, and to be the life of the party. How these romance comics, much like their do-it-yourself personal improvement guides, functioned as educational texts was a counterpoint to the sanctioned formal courses of study in sex ed and family life education, which left young people to cobble together their own education regarding society's expectations regarding sex and romance. Romance comics were an important component of how a certain segment of the U.S. post-war population worked through these issues and learned the new rules for sex and romance in the modern era. Comic books are visually saturated spaces, and the scholarship for both superhero comics and those in other genres has focused primarily on the main narratives of the books. Expanding the scope of that examination to include such elements as advertisements, letters to the editor, and other supplemental featurettes is an opportunity for us to take a closer look at how these texts functioned as informally educational spaces. In the case of romance comics, they were designed to pass on a specific set of cultural practices and attitudes on grooming, courtship, etiquette, and personal health, such as how to avoid polio, or teaching you how awesome the Beatles were. All the while, they created tableaux that depicted objectified images of female domesticity, generally defining proper female behavior in relation to male desire, while simultaneously providing young women with the educational tools to learn to perform those behaviors in pursuit of their own husbands. Well, I would like to thank you for joining me for this presentation. If you have any questions for me, I can be reached at my email address. It's grunske_al@mercer.edu. That's grunzke_al@mercer.edu. And in the interest of shameless self-promotion, if you're interested in this topic, you can read more about it in my recent book, Education in the Female Superhero. And I once again want to thank you for giving me your valuable time. Thanks so much. Bye.